focus your attention this morning on James chapter 5. Martin Luther, the great reformer, had a point when he said, it's not imitation that makes us sons, it's sonship that makes imitators. And that's really the whole thrust of James' message here. He says a lot of practical things about how we should live, but he makes it clear, as we've looked, he makes it clear that our good works do not drive God's love for us. God's love for us drives our good works. Good works, in other words, reflect God's favor. Good works do not direct God's favor, and to get this backwards is to miss the gospel altogether. To go through life believing that our acceptance and our approval is dependent on our achievement is the essence of slavery. The essence of freedom is realizing that acceptance precedes obedience. That we obey, that we follow God, that we do good things because God has already accepted us. God has already approved us in the person of Jesus Christ. So James has been showing what a gospel-driven life looks like, and he's been answering the question, what will your life begin to look like when your heart is radically gripped by God's unconditional love and God's unconditional grace and God's unconditional forgiveness? What will life begin to look like on the ground when God's grace begins to drive you? And this week he talks about money. Now, he has been comparing and contrasting humility and pride. We've been looking at that for the last number of weeks, going back to chapter 4. He's been describing what a pride-filled life looks like and contrasting that to a humility-filled life. A humility-filled life is driven by grace. A pride-filled life is driven by law, and he's been giving us various examples of what a grace-filled life looks like or a humility-filled life looks like in comparison to a pride-filled life. And last week we looked at how pride affects our very planning of our life. That when pride drives our planning, we become self-determined people. This week, he looks at how pride makes us think differently about God's provision. So if pride, in one sense, drives the way we plan, it also drives the way we think about God's provision. And so he talks about money, and in this passage, he exposes the slavery of selfish living and hoarding resources for ourselves instead of trusting in God's provision. That's what he's addressing here. So I want to look at two things that James talks about here in these verses as we lead into our time together around the Lord's Supper in taking communion. Two things I want to look at: the slaughter of greed and the solution to greed, because that's really what he's talking about here. He's talking about greed. He's talking about the way we hoard the gifts that God gives us, because in essence, we are not locating our security in Christ's finished work. And so we place our security in what we can accumulate materially and financially. It's two things: the slaughter of greed and the solution to greed. First thing, he's addressing the way we use our money more so than how much money we have. That's an important thing to realize here. He's addressing the way we use our money more so than how much money we have, because if we don't understand that, then those of us in this room who don't have a lot of money would be tempted to tune out and say, good, it's about time there is a sermon that hits rich people between the eyes. I can sit back and relax and watch them squirm. He's not talking about how much money we have. He's talking about the way that we use our money, because when Jesus said, it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven, he wasn't saying that it's wrong to have money. He was saying that it's hard to have money. Big difference. Having money is not a sin. He was saying that it's hard to have money because, and the reason he made it pretty clear that it's hard to have money is because physical riches can keep you from seeing the spiritual riches that you need more. He was saying this in response to his conversation with the rich young ruler, who came to him and said, what must I do to be saved? And Jesus goes through all the commandments, and the rich young ruler says, I've done all those things. And Jesus said, well, then go back and give everything you have to the poor. And it said he walked away sad because he was a man who had a lot of money. And that's when Jesus said to his disciples, it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter into the kingdom of heaven. Because people who have material wealth and well-being find it very difficult to desperately depend on God's resources. That's what he was saying. It's not wrong to have money. He was saying it's hard to have money. Material wealth is perhaps God's greatest competitor. For that reason, which is why Jesus says in Matthew 6:24, no one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. So here he's addressing how we use our money, not how much we have. He's really addressing, as I mentioned, greed. And he talks here about a double slaughter that greed produces. The slaughter of ourselves, he talks about that. Greed produces the slaughter of ourselves. And then he also talks here about how greed produces the slaughter of other people. And he's addressing specifically here wealthy landowners, which was the measure of wealth back in that day. They were a class of people. Wealthy landowners they were a class of people who were known for their exploitation and oppression of people that did not have what they had. They were known for mistreating their employees. They were known for hoarding and fraudulence. They were the rich people of the day. And they were known for the way they exploited and oppressed people. And he moves from condemning greedy landowners in verse 1 to justifying his condemnation of greedy landowners based on their hoarding, which he talks about in verses 2 and 3, the defrauding of their workers, which he talks about in verse 4, self-indulgence, which he talks about in verse 5, and the oppression of the righteous, which he talks about in verse 6. But he primarily warns against two things: hoarding and self-indulgence. And that exists in the hearts of not only the rich, but also the poor. It's not just rich people or people with a lot of money who are tempted to hoard and self-indulge. People with nothing sometimes are even more tempted to hoard and self-indulge. And so he's talking primarily, in fact, warns primarily against these two things, hoarding and self-indulgence, because these are the two things that lead to the destruction of ourselves and to the destruction of other people. Notice what he says in verses 2 and 3. He warns against hoarding, and he echoes Christ's words almost exactly in Matthew chapter 6, verses 19 to 21. In Matthew chapter 6, Sermon on the Mount, verses 19 through 21, Jesus says, famously, "Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." That's what James is talking about here. He warns against hoarding, and he's almost, as you can imagine, pondering and meditating on what Jesus himself said in Matthew chapter 6. The language is remarkably similar. He talks about rotted riches, which probably meant food. You've just hoarded for yourself food that you don't need. Remember, I made mention last week of how God trained his people in the wilderness to trust him on a daily basis for his provision by giving them manna enough for the day. And he warned them, if you gather manna, if you for 1 second doubt that I am going to provide for you tomorrow, and so you gather for yourself out of the abundance of what I provide for you, enough food for tomorrow, not certain that I'm going to show up tomorrow. By the time you wake up in the morning, that food will be rotted away. He trained them to trust him even when they could not trace him. And that's really what he's talking about here. Rotted riches probably means food. Moth-eaten garments, corroded precious metals, all of those things indicate hoarded wealth. Keeping for yourself what, in essence, you really don't need. That there are people all around us who are in need of what we are hoarding for ourselves. An overabundance of what we need. And we keep it to ourselves. He also warns against self-indulgence in verses 5 and 6. If hoarding is keeping your money for yourself, self-indulgence is spending your money on yourself. And he says here in verse 5, he's talking about living in extravagant comfort, which literally means live at ease. You are living at ease, he says. These verses 1 through 6, are a rebuke. And the way that we know it's a rebuke is because he starts off in verse 1 and says, "Come now." That's a way of saying, look here. Okay? Anybody who begins a conversation with you and says, "Look here," you know that whatever follows is going to be some form of a rebuke, some form of correction. Well, that's what's going on here. James is talking about what a gospel-driven life looks like, and now he gets to the touchy issue of money. And he says, listen, the gospel not only addresses the way that you talk and the way that you plan, but it also addresses the way that you think about money. A grace-driven life affects the way you think about the gifts and the resources that God has given you. And two marks which demonstrate that the gospel of grace has not gripped you when it comes to your use of money is that you hoard and you're self-indulgent. That you think first about your ease and your comfort and not relieving the pain and the agony of financial distress in other people. That's what he's talking about here. It's a rebuke. And he's talking about, in verse 5 specifically when it comes to self-indulgence, he's talking about those of us who spare no expense to make our life easier. That ease and comfort become the great goals we set for ourselves. Now, this happens in 1,000 different ways. I mean, it can be fattening up our retirement. I wrestle. I have a retirement fund. But I've got one set aside because that's what I'm told. And I know there's wisdom, okay? I mean, the Bible doesn't categorically say you shouldn't plan, okay? I mean, Proverbs says a lot about the need to plan, that it's responsible to plan. It's when we plan because we don't trust God to meet our needs is when it becomes a problem. So I struggle sometimes and think, okay, what is the balance between being responsible and planning on the one hand for a time in my life when I will no longer be able to work, to be able to provide for Kim and my family and whatnot. But I think to myself, what's the balance between being wise and planning for the future and hoarding? It's a good thing to wrestle with. It's a good thing to wrestle through. I hope the gospel has so gripped your heart that you're at least wrestling with that you're at least asking those questions. Because that's the kind of thing that James is addressing here. The fact that there are those, and he says this back in chapter 2, if you remember. What good is it if someone comes to your door in need and you say, I hope someone meets your need? I mean, what good is your faith, he says in chapter 2? Not working hard to take what you have to help meet the needs of other people, James says in chapter 2, is a demonstration of dead faith. I mean, he talks in chapter 2 of there being two types of faith, dead faith and living faith. Living faith is bona fide Christianity. Dead faith is just religiosity and moralism. It's wanting to do right because it's right to do right only. That there's no gospel-drivenness about that at all. And so he says one mark of dead faith is that when push comes to shove, you're really not willing to make yourself uncomfortable for the sake of serving other people. You hope, in one sense, that someone meets their needs, but you're not willing to roll up your sleeves and meet their needs yourself. Well, that's really what he's addressing here. He's talking about those of us who spare no expense to make our life easier. He's talking about how ease and comfort become the great goals we set for ourselves. And we get a lot of that. Understand this, that we're all guilty of this at some level. And where we get that idea comes from our culture and the way the American dream has influenced it, not from the Bible. There is nothing, as we'll see in a minute, there's nothing more holy about being poor. That's not true. The gospel of prosperity and the gospel of poverty are equally dangerous, as we'll look at here in a minute. But there is a sense in which this idea that we have that ease and comfort and all of those things become a goal that we set for ourselves. That is really what drives workaholism. Workaholism is driven by this idea that if I work hard enough, now I'll get to spend the rest of my life in an increased measure of ease and comfort. That becomes the goal. It becomes the American dream, influencing how we think about the Christian faith. So James is addressing that. He's talking about those of us who spare no expense to make our life easier. And in verse 6, he talks about how our self-indulgence condemns and murders. Now, what's he talking about there? I mean, those are some pretty heavy words he uses. We could say, okay, I know that self-indulgence is not a good thing, and we should probably, fend it off. But, James uses some heavy language here. That our self-indulgence condemns and murders. Now, the murder here is probably figurative. But he also understands that by withholding the wages, either for a longer time than is just or indefinitely, it imperils the poor even to the point of starvation and death. In other words, there is a sense in which when we self-indulge and when we hoard and we do not seek to meet the pressing needs of those in this world who don't have what we have, there is a sense in which both figuratively and really death happens. And what James is saying here very uncomfortably is if we hoard, if we are self-indulgent, while people all around the world are dying of starvation, some of their blood is on our hands. Now, I had to stop and try to find 1,000 ways to rationalize this away yesterday as I was preparing this, because I just couldn't stomach the fact that I was guilty of hoarding and self-indulgence to the point where, the spiritual and physical blood of other people was on my hands. But this is where God's law comes in and pounds us so that we end up crying out with Paul in Romans 7, "O wretched man that I am, who will deliver me from this body of death?" Prepares the way for the gospel, for the good news. But he also uses here the language of condemning, and that really suggests, back in that day, the law court. It's likely, in other words, that the rich used the court system to enforce their oppression of the poor. They were people of power. They were people of influence. And back then, there was a little concept of impartial law. And if you had the right connections or power, you could sway the decision in your favor. And the point that he's making here is you use your position, your elevated position, to take advantage of those who are weaker than you. Weaker than you financially, weaker than you emotionally, weaker than you intellectually. He's talking about the fact that those of us who have take advantage of those who have not. And he's talking specifically here about the fact that we who are guilty of that give no thought or care to the advancement of others, but only to our own advancement. Now, all of us are guilty of that at some level. We think much more about our advancement than we do brokering and investing what we have in order to advance other people. That's what he's talking about. You don't have to be rich to be guilty of this. You can be middle class, you can be poor to be guilty of this. It's this mindset, it's this prideful, making the connection that James has talked about here between pride and humility. It's this prideful approach to life that thinks first about my advancement before I consider the advancement of other people. And he says that these things bring about the destruction of others in the sense that we rob others of what they need. It's the whole thrust of what he's saying here. This brings about the destruction of other people. This approach to life, this approach to money, this approach to material goods that we have when it comes to hoarding and self-indulgence destroys others in a very practical sense because we keep for ourselves what other people need. Randy Alcorn wrote a remarkable book on money, possessions, and eternity. That's the thick book. It's been condensed into a little book simply called The Treasure Principle. Great book. Very convicting and helpful when it comes to how to spend our money and what money is. But he gives this great illustration in that book where he says, suppose you have something important you want to get to someone who needs it. You wrap it up and you hand it to the FedEx guy. What would you think if instead of delivering the package, he took it home, opened it, and kept it for himself? You'd say, this guy doesn't get it. The package doesn't belong to him. He's just the middleman. His job is to get it from me to the person who needs it. Randy Alcorn goes on and says, just because God puts money in our hands doesn't mean he intends for it to stay there. We don't own the store, we just work here. Okay, it's what the psalmist says in Psalm 67. The whole psalm is devoted to this idea that God has blessed us in order that we might be a blessing. You could put it this way: God prospers you not to raise your standard of living, but to raise your standard of giving. The reason that makes us uncomfortable is twofold, internally and externally. One internal reason, one external reason. The internal reason is we're all sinners and we're all selfish, and we don't like when someone tells us that our money doesn't belong to us. Okay? We earned it, for goodness sake. No, it doesn't. Owners of nothing, stewards of everything. The only thing you and I, whether you're rich or poor, truly own is the sin that makes our salvation necessary. That's it. That's what you and I own. We don't own our children. We don't own our spouse. We don't own our house. I don't care what this world tells me. We own nothing. We're the FedEx guy. Okay? You and I are the FedEx guys. I mean, according to the Bible, that's what we are. I remember my mom telling me when she was teaching me about tithing. My mom and dad did a remarkable job. They would get 10 $1 bills, and they would put it on the table, and they would say something like this: God has given you $10, and he wants you to give one of these, and they took a dollar bill and they put it over on the other side of the table, back to him so that his kingdom can be expanded through the resources that he's entrusted us. And then they said, look how kind God is. Let's just keep 9 for ourselves. And none of it belonged to us in the first place. He gives us 10, and all he asks in return is 1, and lets us keep 9. And my mom, I said, well, that sounds like a great deal, but I mean, if he gave us 10, why can't we keep 10? And I was this, little selfish kid, and she would tell me the story about how there are no U-Hauls on the back of hearses, okay? She's never seen a hearse pulling a U-Haul. And that was her way of saying, you can't take it with you when you go, so give it away now. Jesus saying, do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy and thieves come in and steal. Store up for yourselves treasures in heaven where thieves can't get to it, moths and rust can't get to it. And so he's talking here about this idea that God prospers us, FedEx people. He prospers us not to raise our standard of living, but to raise our standard of giving. And so in all of these verses, chapter 5, verses 1-6, he shows that the result of pride when it comes to our money is the perversion of the gospel's economy and the gospel's sense of justice. So that's how it destroys other people. Well, how does this hoarding and self-indulgence destroy us? His reference in the second part of verse 5 to the day of slaughter is a clear warning of coming judgment for the greedy. That's what he's talking about. I mean, it's clear. No Bible scholars or commentators disagree with that. It's very clear that he's warning of a coming judgment for the hoarders, the greedy people. Psalm 49, verses 16 and 17, so clear. It says, be not afraid when a man becomes rich, when the glory of his house increases, for when he dies, he'll carry nothing away. His glory, or whatever glory he found in his money, will not follow him. I've used this illustration before, but it's been so helpful to me when it comes to understanding the role and the relevance of the gospel in my life, whether it's concerning money or anything else. But Luke chapter 16, Jesus tells that remarkable story about the rich man and Lazarus. Lazarus was obviously very poor, had nothing in this life. The rich man had everything. Both of the men die, and Lazarus goes to heaven and the rich man goes to hell. And it's interesting as you consider that passage, the rich man is never named. Lazarus has a proper name, Lazarus. He had nothing in this life, but he has a proper name in the story. Jesus simply refers to the man who had everything as the rich man. I remember the first time I read that, I thought, why? Why does one of these guys have a name and the other one doesn't? The answer is this: having anchored his identity in his material pursuits, his accomplishments, and his stuff, having made them his idols, the rich man forfeited his very identity. He literally lost himself. He was a man without a name. A name gives us an identity. But this man's identity was located in his stuff, in his power, in his reputation that his money afforded him. I mean, he lived life in this world without the next world in view. He stored up for himself treasures on earth. And the moths and the rust came in and destroyed it. He literally lost himself. And the point of the parable is, where are you locating your identity? What are you depending on to give you the security and the significance that you long for? Money is a surface idol. Money is a surface idol that always goes to serve deeper idols. So money is an idol we serve because what we're really craving is power. And we think money will get us the power we want. Or money is an idol we serve because what we really want is control or respect. We think that if we are rich, people will think we matter. And it's our desire to matter that is driving our pursuit of wealth. Money's always a surface idol. It's never the deep idol. The deep idol is a craving in our hearts. And this can happen, as I mentioned, with poor people and with rich people. Poor people want to matter too. I mean, it's amazing to me how often I will go to, 7-Eleven or a gas station on a Saturday night to, pick something up. And sometimes there's a line out the door with people who don't have much of anything, as far as I can tell, buying lottery tickets. This thirst for significance, this hunger for security that all of us have, that only the gospel can provide, but that we look to money to give us, exists in the hearts of the rich and the poor alike. It's not just one or the other. Greed, according to Luke 16, leads to no nameness. That's the point. J.C. Ryle, who was an Anglican bishop in the 1900s and who wrote a number of excellent books, said this when it came to money. A day is coming when banknotes will be as useless as rags, and gold will be as worthless as the dust of the earth. A day is coming when thousands will care nothing for the things for which they once lived, and will desire nothing so much as the things which they once despised. The mansions and palaces will be forgotten in the desire of a house not made with hands. The favor of the rich and great will be remembered no more in the longing for the favor of the King of Kings. The silks and satins and velvets and laces will be lost sight of in the anxious need of the robe of Christ's righteousness. All will be altered. All will be changed in the great day of the Lord's return. This is how hoarding and self-indulgence destroys us. It not only destroys us here, but it destroys us there. It not only shrinks us here, but we become a person without an identity and without a name there. A day is coming, Ryle says, when the value of all things will be altered. All things. Which begs the question, really, for me and for all of us, are we really living in this world with the next world in view? Whenever we forget the gospel of God's love and God's grace, the undertow of money, either the money we have or the money we long to have, threatens to sweep us away. So, that's the slaughter of greed. It slaughters other people, it slaughters us. So what's the solution? Because everything I've said so far is bad news. Okay, we're all guilty of this at some level, whether you're rich or whether you're poor. We all think about our advancement before we think about the advancement of others. We think about our comfort before we think about the comfort of others. We locate our security and our safety in what we can get for ourselves and not what God in Christ has given us. So, we're all guilty of this. So what's the solution? If the sermon ended here, it would be only bad news. What's the solution? Let me begin by saying the solution to greed is not poverty. Many people make that mistake. Now, it is true that in order to keep money from becoming an idol, the best way to handle it is to give it away. Okay, that is true. The less I give, the more idolatrous money becomes to me. The more I give, the less I think about it, actually. And so it is true that the best way to ensure that money doesn't become an idol is to give it away. But the solution to greed is not poverty, because it is never only a money issue. There's a sin underneath the sin. As I said a couple weeks ago, we have this remarkable tendency to focus only on the fruit of the problem and never address the root of the problem. The gospel always addresses the root of the problem. When the gospel addresses the root of the problem, then gospel fruit begins to develop. But whether it's in our parenting or in other relationships with our spouse or our friends or colleagues or whatever, we spend most of our lives, and Christians are especially guilty of this, we spend most of our lives simply addressing the fruit. We spend most of our lives thinking that real Christianity involves, in an exclusive sense, behavioral cleanup. Behavioral compliance to rules is always short-lived, always, and transient. The heart is always what God is after. And so the reason poverty is not the solution to greed is because it's not simply a money issue. It's a heart issue. Some people become self-righteous about having money, saying they earned it with hard work, and they therefore look down on others, concluding that they're lazy. Then none of us are guilty of that, are we? I'm sure none of you are. We become self-righteous about our money because we conclude, we worked hard for this. Everybody has the same opportunities. And if these people would simply work hard, they would stop asking me for money, and they would be able to establish themselves. Not everybody is given the same opportunity, first of all. Come on, I grew up with a lot more than a lot of people in this world. I was able to go to private Christian schools. I was raised in a Christian home. My dad had a good job and was able to provide for our family in such a way that my mom didn't have to work, and she was always home when we got home from school, and all of those things. Not everybody's given the same chance. That's a pipe dream. It's not true. If you think that's true, go spend a year in the inner city and tell me if that's true. Okay, it's not true. Okay, there's a lot that goes on in our lives that we don't have any control over. Okay? A lot in life that was handed to us in one way, shape, or form. And so some people become self-righteous about having money. Other people become self-righteous about not having money. Saying that the rich care too much about material goods, and therefore it's the poor who are really more holy. Self-righteousness goes in both directions. Only the gospel can crush self-righteousness, and that's the issue. That's the hard issue. Rich people thinking they're better than poor people because they have money. Poor people thinking they're better than rich people because they don't have money. See what happens? Not only Is self-righteousness the problem? But even deeper than that, oftentimes, depending on where we are in life, we become self-righteous against those who are self-righteous. Okay? It's unavoidable. No matter how deep you go in your heart, you find stuff that only the gospel can address. You'll never get to a point let me say it this way. We spend so much time thinking about the Christian life is all about moral progress and personal improvement. How much time we waste doing that? We waste more time thinking about what we need to do so that we don't think nearly enough about what Jesus has already done. And it doesn't make any sense at all, because even the Apostle Paul at the end of his life was able to say, I'm the chief of sinners. I'm the worst guy that I know. At the end of his life. And his ability to admit that is the spiritual progress that the Bible talks about. It's an amazing thing. The deeper we go into our hearts, the worse that we see we really are. And that's where only the gospel of God's grace can come in and address us and change us. Not change us in the sense that we become better and better. Or maybe we do become better and better, but what does it actually mean to become better? What it actually means, in other words, to realize that the Christian life is not about your personal improvement, is improvement. To realize that the Christian life is not first and foremost about your getting better, is what it means to get better. How else do you explain Apostle Paul saying at the end of his life, I'm the chief of sinners, I'm the worst guy I know. I'm the worst guy that I know. So many Christians, as they get older, they think, I'm getting better and I'm better and better. Well, that depends on if your definition of better is your willingness to admit that you're actually worse. That's it. You want to know what getting better is? Getting better, spiritual maturity, okay, now I'm off on a tangent, sorry. Spiritual maturity is measured by your willingness to say, in humility, like James has been addressing, I'm messed up. Thank God for Jesus. That's spiritual maturity. Spiritual maturity is not how well you've cleaned up your act or, that's not it. Some of the people who are most spiritually mature are the people who are the most messed up. I had a conversation with a guy last Sunday who came up to me, okay, and he acknowledged that he was homeless and acknowledged that he was an alcoholic. And he said he hadn't been to church in a long time, but with tears said, I don't want anything from you or the church. I'm not asking for any handouts at all. For the first time in 25 years, I'm finally acknowledging the fact that I am an alcoholic. I have got a disease that has ruined my life. And my only hope is Jesus. That is spiritual maturity, okay? Not how well you clean up your act and all that stuff. So it's not, how do we deal with the money problem? How do we deal with the greed issue? We deal with the greed issue by, becoming poor. No, that's not how you deal with the greed issue, because it's not a greed issue, it's a self-righteousness issue. And greed exists in the hearts of the poor just as much as it does in the hearts of the rich. The gospel, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, the gospel of prosperity and the gospel of poverty are equally dangerous. In our circles, we talk a lot about the prosperity gospel. All these TV preachers out there that say that, God is all about health, wealth, and prosperity, and they drive, convertible Bentleys and, sit on golden thrones on television. Okay, we make fun of that. I understand. Okay, I understand. But the gospel of poverty is just as dangerous. Just as dangerous. Seeking poverty and seeking prosperity are attempts to secure freedom and rightness apart from the finished work of Christ. You cannot save yourself by saying no to riches any more than you can save yourself by saying yes to riches. And it's the finished work of Christ that's in view here, as James tells of a coming day when the value of everything will be altered. Greedy people are people who have concluded that money can provide them with the security, the value, the power, the respect, and the freedom they long for. Listen, just give you some insight here. Every temptation to sin is a temptation to disbelieve the gospel. I'll explain that in a second, but you know the primary sin that God addresses? We talk about, pride and, lust and greed and, the 7 deadly sins. I mean, we talk about sinful behavior and all that stuff. Do you know what the primary sin is underneath every other sin? Unbelief. Failure to believe the gospel. That's what the devil was getting at in the Garden of Eden. He was trying to get Adam and Eve to not believe God. Unbelief is the birth mother of every sin. And so, every temptation to sin is a temptation to disbelieve the gospel. The temptation to secure for myself in that moment something I think I need in order to be happy, something I don't yet have, meaning, liberty, validation, and so on. Greed happens when we fail to believe that everything I need in Christ I already have. That's what I'm talking about. Underneath every temptation to sin is the temptation to disbelieve the gospel. To disbelieve that everything I need in Christ I have. Why do we hoard? Why are we self-indulgent? It's a gospel issue. It's a failure to believe that all of the resources, all of the riches that Christ secured for us are now ours in Christ. When we don't believe that, we keep stuff to ourselves. We self-indulge, we live for the moment, all of those things. It happens when we fail to believe in the rich resources that are already ours in the gospel. So the solution to greediness is a reorientation to the generosity of Christ in the gospel. How do we get rid of that? It's destroying us, it's destroying others. How do we get rid of it? It doesn't happen by getting your act together. It happens as you reorient yourself to the generosity of Christ in the gospel. And let me tell you what this doesn't mean, okay? This is so important because so easily we can make this mistake. This doesn't mean redoubled efforts to be generous because Jesus was generous. That's not what it means to be gospel-driven. It doesn't mean we got to work harder to be generous because Jesus himself was generous and we have to follow his example. As if the work of Christ was simply to set before us an example. Jesus did not come to first make bad people good. He came to make dead people live. Big difference. Growth in the Christian life is not from vice to virtue. It's from virtue to grace. What Luther called God our needing to repent not only of our bad works, but our damnable good works, he said. So, this doesn't mean redoubled efforts to be generous because Jesus was generous. It means being gripped by the radicality of God's unconditional grace. That's what it means. We don't become generous by asking, what would Jesus do? It's not what we do. We become generous when our hearts are gripped by what Jesus has already done. That's when we become generous. Generosity happens when the rich resources of the gospel smash any sense of need to secure for ourselves anything beyond what Christ has already secured for us. Okay, I'm going to say that again, because that's the key that unlocks this entire passage. Generosity happens when the rich resources of the gospel smash any sense of need to secure for ourselves anything beyond what Christ has already secured for us. That's the answer. So, how does that connect to Palm Sunday? Well, it connects directly with Palm Sunday, which is a perfect way to prepare our hearts before we come to the Lord's Supper. Palm Sunday tells us of the God of great expenditure, who gave everything that we might possess all. That though Christ was rich, he became poor for our sake, so that by his poverty we might become rich. Palm Sunday tells us of a God who spends, of a God who spent everything by becoming nothing, so that we might have everything. It's what it is. It's a man riding in on a donkey to triumph over sin and death by becoming sin and death on our behalf. And that's what we celebrate when we gather around the Lord's Supper. It's not a somber thing that we do, it's a celebration. And Paul tells us to examine ourselves before we come to the Lord's table. He's not saying confess every known sin. You can't do it. You're way worse than you think you are. That's not what he's saying. He's saying, look again at the darkness and the depth of your need so that you can emerge from your evaluation thanking God for Jesus. As one friend wrote to me this week, it's when we look at that man's cross and that man's blood that the devil runs. That's what we celebrate. We celebrate his cross, his blood, not what we do, what he has done. We need an advocate, we need a friend, but what we need more than anything is a substitute. And that's what we celebrate.